Hi, my name's Yoni Ejo, and I'm a social worker and an adoption coach. I'm also an adoptive mum of two girls, and I'm wanting to talk to you about trauma and the impact of trauma. And I guess I've got a personal interest in it, partly because I'm always confused as to why we don't talk more about trauma within the adoption and the social care space, but also because my experience as an adopted adult has also been impacted on by the trauma that I experienced. And even though I was very young when I was adopted, I was not even a year old, I spent the first year of my life, I think, with different foster carers, and I think I am now looking at the impacts of that. So I hope that you will find this useful. I'd love to hear your feedback, and what I'm going to cover today is why it's important for adopters to understand trauma, what trauma is, how it impacts on children, and also some skills and strategies that you might find helpful to help your adoptive child manage their feelings and the impacts of trauma. So, see you in the next slide. Take care. So, why is it important for adopters to understand trauma? Adopters obviously need to understand the children that they're caring for and to get an understanding of what motivates those children. And I'm sure you'd agree that they need to be proactive, persistent, insistent, insecure in details about their child's previous life, however young they are when they join their adoptive family. When we, as adopters and carers, or people working with children, don't understand trauma, the implications of trauma and how it impacts on the child's brain, we're much more likely to see their actions and the way that the child behaves as something that's deliberate, that's done to be defiant or difficult or naughty. And we're much less likely, if we don't understand trauma, to see that behaviour as what it actually is, a largely unconscious reaction to triggers and stimulation based on the child's early past experiences. So how can we define trauma? Childhood trauma is often described as serious adverse childhood experiences. Those children may go through a range of experiences that can be classified as psychological trauma. That might be experiencing abuse, neglect, physical assault, sexual abuse, or also witnessing the abuse of others, as in domestic violence, or having a child who has a parent with a mental health problem or a substance misuse. In addition, it's beginning to be recognised the impact of trauma, of the traumatic impact of racism on Black and ethnic minority children. And so I would say that no Black or minority ethnic child is immune to the trauma that's experienced by seeing a culture that doesn't reflect their experience, as well as experiencing direct racism. So as a result of these traumatic experiences, a child who has grown up in a household with adverse childhood experiences will have established responses and adaptive behaviours which will serve them while they're experiencing those difficulties in a family, while they're the subject of trauma and abuse. But those strategies can cause problems when they're out of that household or that situation. So what are ACEs? ACEs are adverse childhood experiences or traumatic events that occurred in childhood, and that being from 0 to 17. A landmark study looked in depth into ACEs. It was a study that occurred nearly 20 years ago, and it established the association between traumatic childhood experiences and the leading causes of morbidity and mortality in the US. And in that study, the researchers from Kaiser Permanente, which was a primary care company in the US, and the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, found a direct relationship between the instances of trauma and defined as I say, about sexual, emotional, physical, or psychological abuse, or being raised in neglectful households, and the rate of chronic obstructive lung disease, lung cancer, heart disease, and liver disease, as well as depression, substance abuse, suicide, and risky behaviours. The study evaluated medical insurance patients, and therefore that group were mainly white and mainly middle class. Despite this, they found that 1 in 6 of those studied had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. 61% of those who were surveyed said that they'd experienced at least one ACE in their childhood. And it was identified that women and ethnic minorities were more likely to have experienced 4 or more ACEs in their childhood. The study found that exposure to childhood ACEs could increase the likelihood of future health issues such as alcoholism, teen pregnancy, depression, diabetes, intimate partner violence, suicide, severe obesity, drug use, or homelessness. So how can trauma affect the brain? The way trauma influences brain development will be different for each child. Just as each child will have different emotional responses to a traumatic event, the way that the brain responds to trauma will also vary with children. There's a range of areas of the brain which are impacted, and I'll summarise some of them. The amygdala. The amygdala is designed to detect and react to people, places, and things in the environment that can be dangerous. This is important for safety and survival. After trauma, the amygdala can become even more highly attuned to potential threats in the environment, leading a child to closely monitor their surroundings and make sure that they are safe and have such strong emotional bonds and reactions to people, places, or things that they may find threatening or that remind them of the trauma. This heightened attention to potential threats in the environment can make it really hard for children to pay attention in school, go new places, or interact with people they don't know. The medial prefrontal cortex. The medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC for short. This area of the brain helps to control the activity of the amygdala and is involved in learning that previously threatened people or places are now safe. Connections between the FC, and the amygdala are sometimes not as strong in children who have experienced trauma. As a result, this area of the brain is not as efficient or able to reduce amygdala's reactivity to people, places, and the things that are in fact safe and no longer predict danger. This can lead to persistent elevations in fear, anxiety about cues that remind children of the trauma that they've experienced. The hippocampus. The hippocampus is involved in learning and memory. Impairments in learning and memory have been seen in children who've experienced trauma. This suggests that trauma may affect how the hippocampus actually develops. Trauma is likely to impact on the various types of learning and memory that the child is developing, such as the ability to remember information about their surroundings. As a result, children who experience trauma may not be able to retain information, for example, how to tell if one situation is safe or another is dangerous. Critically, these changes in the brain are not permanent. Fortunately, the brain is remarkably plastic, which means that it changes in response to social and environmental experiences. This enables us to learn, form relationships with people, and develop new skills. In the brain that happen after trauma can improve over time. This is particularly likely to happen when children experience safe, stable, and supportive environments after trauma. Trauma, whether it is as a result of something done to the child, or for older children, even something done by themselves, it almost always makes it difficult for them to engage in close relationships. After experiencing something so difficult to talk about, the child struggles to learn to trust themselves again, and this can result in them being really reluctant to surrender to a close relationship after they feel that they have been violated. Impact on attachment and relationships. Children learn about the world through their caregivers and their attachment figures. They learn to trust others and regulate their emotions, interact with the world through close relationships. Traumatised children's perspective on the world and the place that they take in it can be significantly distorted by abuse. They learn that adults are not trustworthy and that the majority do have difficult experiences developing strong and healthy bonds with the people who care for them. They can have trouble controlling and voicing their emotions. They may react violently or inappropriately to situations. We develop our skills in building relationships initially through our parents and carers, so the impact on future relationships with family, friends, and authority figures, such as teachers and police officers, is significant. Physical health, body and brain. The body and mind are constantly developing as a child. Normal functions in the child is significantly impacted by the child's environment. When a child grows up afraid or in constant or extreme stress, the immune system and the body's stress responses may not develop normally. Later on, when the child is exposed even to normal levels of stress, these systems can respond as if the individual was experiencing extreme stress. For example, the child may experience psychological reactions such as rapid breathing, heart pounding, or may shut down entirely in stressful situations. This response was very helpful when living with constant stress, but now is out of proportion to the normal stresses and strains faced in day-to-day life. This can be perceived by others as overreacting, but it is actually a physiological response the child is not in control of. Stress can impair the development of the brain and the nervous system. Neglectful environments where stimulation is absent may limit the brain from developing into its full potential. Children with complex trauma histories may develop chronic or recurrent physical issues, such as headaches or stomach aches. Young people who've experienced complex trauma frequently suffer from body dysregulation, meaning that they are over and or under responding to sensory stimulation. For example, they may be hypersensitive to sounds, lights, smells, or touch. They may also be unaware of pain, discomfort, or conversely, they may complain of chronic pain in various body areas for which no medical cause can be identified. Emotional responses. Children who have experienced complex trauma often have difficulty identifying, expressing, and managing emotions, and may have limited language for those feelings. They can internalize their stress reactions, so can experience depression, anxiety, or anger. A child may react to a reminder, which is also called a trigger, of the traumatic event that they've experienced with fear, anger, sadness, or avoidance. So for children who's experienced complex trauma, reminders can often be everywhere. Having never learnt how to calm themselves down when upset, many traumatised children have never learnt how to calm themselves down when upset. So many are easily overwhelmed. They may quickly give up, trying even small tasks when presented with a challenge. They may feel it's much easier not to try. Hyper-arousal. This is when the child is presented as on guard, they cannot relax easily, and may be hypervigilant. The child struggles to concentrate and may experience an irregular heartbeat, sensitivity to pain, sleep problems, and may be quick to become angry or aggressive. They may also respond in ways that are unpredictable. A child who feels powerless or who grew up fearing abusive adults may act aggressively or defensively for any perceived blame or attack, or they may seek to control their lives to such a high degree that they are felt rigid or alternatively overcompliant. Disassociation. This is the natural process the brain creates to protect the child in response to trauma when they feel in danger or at risk of harm. It's not a mental illness, and it's the child's brain's way of finding ways to cope with extreme circumstances that are inescapable. The limbic, or emotional system, turns down feelings. So an extreme type of disassociation is dissociative identity disorder, when different parts of the personality switch and the person or child is unaware of events that occur when responding with other personalities. This is believed to be a response to the most severe and torturous abuse. Other types of disassociation is when the individual is completely removed from their own feelings caused by the traumatic experiences. They are no longer in touch with their feelings and emotions. Symptoms also include feeling low, depressed, empty. The child may be withdrawn, and trauma can impact on the memory. Some children can feel very distant from their physical body and may experience physical challenges or coordination issues. Thinking and learning. Children can struggle to think clearly, to reason and problem solve. Trauma can also impact on memory. It's rendered the child challenging and challenges in making plans ahead or anticipating consequences. All the child's resources are used in managing the impact of the trauma. They may have difficulty in concentrating, having challenges in language development and abstract reasoning skills. Many children who have experienced complex trauma have learning difficulties of some description, which leaves them requiring support academically in some situations. Self-concept and future orientation. Children learning their self-worth from the reactions and views of adults around them. Abuse and neglect will make a child feel worthless and despondent. Children often blame themselves, as it would seem safer to blame themselves than to recognise that the parent who they rely on entirely is unreliable and dangerous. So the child experiences shame, guilt, low self-esteem and poor self-image, which all of which are common in children who've experienced complex trauma. Living with traumatised children. Here are some strategies that you might find helpful when caring for traumatised children. Take trigger inventories with children, learn their patterns and also help them to learn their own patterns too. What occasions cause them most stress? Also, if you're in a position to do so, ask social workers, former carers, parents or teachers about the child. Learn all you can about trauma. Train in strategies for self-regulation and make sensory strategies a common practice for the whole family. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Community development. Build the child's connections with you and with their peers. Make it a habit to encourage self-regulation skills and develop them. And preempt issues. Don't wait for the child to escalate. Try and intervene and distract. Set limits with the child. Don't be consistent. Recognize and articulate the child's feelings to help them learn to recognize their own feelings too. It's also helpful to debrief together after incidents with your child, with your partner, teachers, whichever, depending on the situation. Review the context, what happened, and what escalated within that situation. It's also important to acknowledge your own feelings. You need to recognize your own triggers and when you are shutting down. So when you're perhaps notice that you're being avoidant or short in temper or numbing yourself, then it's worth spending some time doing your own self-regulation strategies and self-care. In supporting a child to repair, it's important to let them know how important they are to you. And ultimately, try and avoid taking on the child's trauma as your own. And when that's challenging, help the child to plan for the future with a sense of hope and purpose. A child needs to value themselves, and this child has been taught that the world is not a safe or happy place. So when they come to live with you, they will have lived from moment to moment in survival mode. And the child will have limited experience of thinking or planning for the future. So it's really helpful for you to help the child to think about the future, perhaps keeping a gratitude diary or journal, encourage them to think about positive things that are coming on. Healing. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to heal itself by forming new connections, which means that we can overcome and reverse trauma's damaging impacts. During the healing process, adults and children can rewire and retrain their brain to reverse the effects of trauma. Individuals can reinforce their prefrontal cortex and increase rationality and control. You can strengthen the abilities of your hippocampus and improve memory effectiveness. It can also be subdued to the hyperactivity of the amygdala, which will reduce feelings of stress and anxiety. Researchers have also discovered that skin-to-skin closeness has incredibly positive psychological benefits when separation can have equally detrimental impacts. So parents holding children skin to skin has been studied for a decade and found to have substantial benefits both for parent and child. It's fair to say that most studies concentrate on mothers, but I'm sure it's the same whatever gender. Research on our nearest relatives, primates, indicates that separation is so traumatic to the baby that it impacts the monkey's body system. There is a loss of baby temperature, releases of stress hormones, cortisol, cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat, agitation, sleep disturbances, immunological systems are compromised. Although when they are reunited, there are long-term impacts, including sleep patterns and issues with immunity. So what to do? Traumatised children thrive on consistency, predictability in their routines, and preparation when new or different activities are planned. Nurturing and affectionate care can be therapeutic when provided within the child's realm of comfort. Allow the child to initiate physical contact. This will help to establish a sense of trust in the child, especially if other adults have compromised their sense of power and agency over their own body through abuse. Traumatised children need clear boundaries. However, the impact of trauma will create responses, triggers, and may result in their emotional age being less than their chronological age. It's important to have realistic expectations of the child, to be flexible and consistent as a parent. It's helpful to reduce choices for the child to 2 or 3 at most. It's not uncommon for children to suffer sleep issues, impulsivity, anxiety, even years after the traumatic event has ended. More tips for helping children who've experienced trauma. Make sure the child's environment is safe and feels as safe as possible. Minimize fighting, arguing, play fighting, or raised voices that may seem likely to lead to violence. Keep doors locked. Review how the child should handle calls or somebody coming to the door who is unfamiliar. Create a safety plan for situations where there may be ongoing dangers. Set up a written plan for specific risky situations that the child might encounter. Have backup plans for getting into contact when separated or unable to reach each other by usual methods. Identify safe people and places that the child can turn to if necessary. Ensure that the child, age appropriately, knows their address and their phone number. Increase support and reassurance from yourselves and any other caregivers. Give lots of reassurance. Be specific that the situation is now safe. Be careful not to communicate that because of the trauma, the world should be seen as a very dangerous place. Help children face up to non-dangerous situations to learn how to deal with them. Identify people, places and topics, things that may be reminders of the trauma but are not in themselves dangerous, that the child seems to be reacting strongly or avoiding. Support children in approaching, not avoiding, those known dangerous reminders. Help them to learn to tell the difference between danger and non-dangerous reminders, e.g., every raised voice is not a sign of an impending domestic violence incident. Make sure your children have coping skills that they can use. Review coping skills such as relaxation, breathing, distraction, listening to a favourite song, playing a game, meditating. Identify which ones the child is likely to use and enjoys using and practice it with them. Promote the child to use the coping skills and strategies when he or she seems to be getting anxious or worried unnecessarily. It's useful age appropriately to find them a therapist who can provide trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy if they have persistent post-traumatic stress symptoms. If the child has significant ongoing distress, TFCBT is a proven treatment, but it's not the only one. These are all strategies to prevent any brain changes from becoming permanent and to restore the child to normal functioning. You can support your child's brain development by finding out what the adaptive behaviours are and helping them work through them. While it may be concerning that adopted children have had adverse childhood experiences, and it might feel like a risky situation to take on, in terms of outcomes, there's significant evidence that more than 3/4 of adoptions continue till the child's adulthood. The Maudsley Hospital sampled a group of children adopted from care in the mid-range of their childhood, and they followed up at an average age of around 13, and this was 99 children. And this study showed that 23% of placements had disrupted, and that's Quinton, Rushton and Dance et al. 1998. Of those continuing placements, nearly half of those placements were recorded as a positive experience by adopters. But in 28% of the placements, there were substantial difficulties even after 6 years of the adoption proceeding. These adoptive parents reported being challenged by continuing developmental, behavioural and social difficulties. In the Selwyn et al. Longitudinal non-infant adoption study in 2006, 17% of placements disrupted and only 2/5 of the children followed up at an average of 7 years later were found to be free from behavioural problems. However, both of the sub-studies indicate that adoption can provide a stable home for the majority of the children that are placed, although many problems don't disappear rapidly after placement, and so it's really reinforcing the need for support and adoption support for many years into the placement. And I think that is really important that adopters and yourselves identify sources of support, be that within the family, groups, adoption support groups, and networks, and also going back to the agency and seeking adoption support going forward when ideally before you need it, because something that adoption agencies have fed back to me is that sometimes adopters leave seeking support too late, and so the adoption support fund and similar situations can be made available to adopters at an earlier stage. So I would definitely recommend that. I hope this has been useful. Do give me some feedback and comments, and I'll see you soon.